My 17-year-old daughter cut class on what was supposed to be just an ordinary morning, drove 45 minutes to another city with her best friend in a car they had no business joyriding in, and ended up sitting in a parking lot staring through a restaurant window at her own mother kissing a man who wasn't me. Her friend took photos. Instead of confronting her mother or pretending she didn't see what she saw, my daughter drove home, walked into my office, handed me her phone, and said these words that I can still hear echoing in my head every single time I close my eyes. "Dad, I need to show you something." That moment cracked open a door that led to a fault-based divorce under New Hampshire RSA 458.7, a private detective uncovering an affair that had been going on for months, a co-respondent who got legally named and served in our divorce proceedings, and a custody outcome that my wife never saw coming because she spent the entire process trying to turn our daughter against me instead of taking responsibility for what she did. None of it ended well for her. This is how all of it happened. We'd been together for close to 20 years by the time everything fell apart, met in our early 20s at a football game, started dating that same summer, and got married about 2 years later at a small ceremony in the backyard of her parents' house in Concord. We settled in the Nashua area because that's where most of my client base was concentrated, and it was close enough to the Massachusetts border that she had options for work on either side of the state line. I built a career as an independent IT infrastructure consultant, the kind of work where companies bring you in to assess their systems, design upgrades, manage migrations, and troubleshoot problems that their in-house teams can't handle. By the time this story starts, I was billing around $135 an hour and pulling in roughly $140,000 a year before taxes, sometimes more, depending on the project load. I worked from a home office most days, unless I had an on-site engagement, which meant I was usually the one picking our daughter up from school when she was younger and handling things around the house while my wife was at work. She held a retail management position at a department store in the Pheasant Lane Mall for several years before our daughter was born, then stepped back to part-time hours at a local boutique once the baby came. Eventually, she went back to full-time work in office administration for a small insurance agency closer to Manchester, making around $42,000 a year. Between my income, her salary, and the equity we built in the house over 15 years of mortgage payments, we had a comfortable life by any reasonable standard. Our daughter was the center of everything we did. She was a strong student, played volleyball for her high school team, and had already started narrowing down her college list by the time she hit her senior year. From where I was sitting, we looked like a family that had figured it out. But the truth is, things between my wife and me had been slowly cooling off for about 3 years before any of this came to the surface. The conversations got shorter, the evenings got quieter, and somewhere along the way, we turned into two people sharing a house more than two people sharing a marriage. I told myself it was just a natural drift that happens when you've been with someone for nearly 2 decades and your kid is about to leave for college. I told myself a lot of things that kept me comfortable enough to ignore what was shifting right in front of me. My daughter was 4 months into her senior year when she did something completely out of character that accidentally blew my entire life wide open. Her best friend had just gotten a used car for her 18th birthday, a little silver hatchback that was the first set of wheels either of them had ever had access to without a parent attached. And on a morning when they were both supposed to be sitting in second period, they decided to skip class and take the car out for a ride. They drove east on Route 101 with no real plan, just two high school seniors feeling invincible and burning through a tank of gas because the weather was clear and the road was open. They ended up in Portsmouth, about 45 minutes from where we lived, because my daughter's friend had always wanted to see the old downtown area near the waterfront. They parked on a side street, walked around for maybe half an hour, and then decided to grab lunch at a small cafe near the harbor. But before they even made it to the door, my daughter stopped walking because through the front window of a restaurant across the street, she could see her mother sitting at a table with a man she had never seen before, and they were not just eating lunch. He had his hand on the side of her face, and she was leaning into him in a way that left absolutely zero room for interpretation. Then he kissed her, and my daughter watched the whole thing from 30 feet away on the other side of a piece of glass. Her friend grabbed her arm and pulled her behind a parked car before my wife could look up and see them standing there. And then her friend did something that would become the single most important piece of evidence in everything that followed. She pulled out her phone and started taking photographs through the restaurant window from behind that car, zooming in as far as the camera would go. She got 4 clear shots, all time-stamped and geotagged by the phone's built-in location data. My wife's face was visible in every single one of them, and in 2 of the photos, the man's face was clear enough to identify. My daughter told me later that she almost threw up in the parking lot and that her friend had to drive the entire way home because her hands were shaking too badly to hold the steering wheel. She didn't call her mother. She didn't send a text. Once her friend got her home, my daughter sat in her friend's car in our driveway for 10 minutes trying to figure out what to do, and then came inside and found me in my office working on a systems proposal for a client in Manchester. When she handed me that phone and I swiped through those 4 photographs, something inside my chest collapsed in a way that I genuinely didn't think was possible. I'd been married to that woman for 18 years. I'd built every piece of our life around the assumption that we were in this thing together, and now I was staring at photographic proof that she was sitting in a restaurant in a city 45 minutes away from our home, kissing another man in broad daylight on a morning when she told me she had a staff meeting that was going to run through lunch. My daughter stood in my doorway with tears running down her face and waited for me to say something. And what I said to her in that moment is something I thought about very carefully before it came out of my mouth. I told her that this was not her fault, that she didn't do anything wrong by telling me, and that I was going to handle this the right way, which meant nobody was going to say a word to her mother about what we'd just seen. Not tonight, not this week, not until I had a plan that protected all 3 of us. My daughter looked at me and shook her head, and from that moment forward, she and I carried a secret that sat between us like a lead weight for the next several weeks while I quietly put everything into motion. The very next morning, I called a licensed private investigator operating out of Hillsborough County. In New Hampshire, private investigators are licensed through the state under RSA 106F, the Private Investigators and Security Guards Act, and any evidence they collect through legal surveillance methods is generally admissible in court proceedings. I gave him the 2 photographs where the man's face was visible and asked him to identify who this person was, where he lived, and how long this had potentially been going on. The PI charged me a $2,500 retainer with a $175 per hour rate after that, and I paid it out of a personal account my wife didn't have access to. Within 10 days, he came back with the full report. The man in the photographs was 44 years old, lived in a townhouse complex in Dover, worked as a regional sales manager for a building materials distributor, and was married with 2 children under the age of 12. The PI had conducted physical surveillance on my wife over a 9-day period and documented her driving to the man's townhouse on 4 separate occasions during hours when she was supposed to be at her office job in Manchester. He captured photographs of her entering and exiting the man's residence with timestamps, GPS, verified route data from a tracker I authorized on our jointly owned vehicle, and detailed activity logs showing she typically arrived around 10 in the morning and didn't leave until early afternoon. On 2 of those occasions, the man's own car was already in the driveway, confirming he was home when she was inside. The PI also pulled publicly available records and confirmed the man's marriage license, his home address, and his wife's name and place of employment. I now had photographic evidence from my daughter's friend, corroborated by professional surveillance documentation showing a pattern of repeated visits over a sustained period. And the man had a wife and 2 kids of his own who had absolutely no idea what was going on. My daughter and I sat at the kitchen table one evening while my wife was out doing whatever she was actually doing, and we looked at the PI report together. I asked my daughter how she wanted to handle this because her life was about to get turned upside down too, and I wanted her to feel like she had a voice in what came next. She looked at me with a steadiness that made her seem 10 years older than 17 and said, "Don't tell her anything. Just get us out of this." That's exactly what I did. I retained a family law attorney in Nashua who had extensive experience with fault-based divorce proceedings under New Hampshire law. She walked me through every piece of the legal framework in a way that changed how I approached every single decision from that point forward. Under New Hampshire RSA 458.7, a spouse can file for divorce on fault-based grounds, and adultery is one of the specifically enumerated grounds listed in the statute. But here's the part that makes New Hampshire different from almost every other state in the country. When you file for divorce on grounds of adultery in New Hampshire, the affair partner, known legally as the co-respondent, must be identified by name in the divorce petition and must be formally served with legal papers. That means the other man doesn't just get to hide in the shadows while my wife's attorney negotiates a quiet settlement. He gets named in a legal filing that becomes part of the public court record, and a sheriff or process server physically delivers those papers to him at his home or his workplace, notifying him that he's been made a party to a divorce proceeding. My attorney told me that this requirement under New Hampshire law is one of the most powerful tools available to the petitioning spouse, because it doesn't just establish the affair as a legal fact, it also puts enormous pressure on the co-respondent, especially when that person has their own marriage and family to protect. And in this case, the co-respondent absolutely did have a marriage and family to protect. He had a wife and 2 children sitting in a townhouse in Dover who had no idea that a woman from Nashua had been driving to their home multiple times a week while they were at work and school. My attorney also explained how the fault finding would affect the 3 areas where it mattered most. Property division. New Hampshire is an equitable distribution state under RSA 458.16-A, which means the court divides marital property in a way that's fair, not necessarily equal. The statute lists over a dozen factors the judge can consider, and one of those factors is the fault of either party if it caused the breakdown of the marriage and resulted in substantial emotional distress or economic harm. And here's something that makes New Hampshire particularly aggressive on this front. Unlike most states, inherited property and assets acquired before the marriage are still considered part of the divisible estate. That meant everything was on the table, including equity in the home, retirement accounts, savings, vehicles, and any other asset either of us owned. If I could prove that her adultery caused the breakdown of the marriage and caused me substantial emotional distress, the court had the authority to award me a disproportionate share of the marital estate. Alimony. Under RSA 458.19, the court considers fault as a specific statutory factor when determining whether to award spousal support, how much to award, and for how long. Given that I was earning significantly more than she was, a clean no-fault divorce could have resulted in me paying alimony for up to 9 years based on our 18-year marriage, since New Hampshire caps term alimony at 50% of the marriage length under RSA 458.19-A. But a proven fault finding for adultery gave the court grounds to reduce that significantly or deny it altogether. Custody. New Hampshire courts determine custody based on the best interests of the child under RSA 461-A.6. And while adultery alone doesn't automatically affect custody, the court can consider a parent's conduct during the marriage when evaluating judgment, stability, and the emotional environment the parent provides. And in this case, I had a 17-year-old daughter who had been directly and psychologically impacted by witnessing her mother's infidelity firsthand. That wasn't a hypothetical harm. It was a documented, specific, real-world impact on the child that any family court judge would take seriously. My attorney told me to start building the record. I enrolled my daughter in sessions with a licensed family therapist who could document the emotional impact of what she'd witnessed and provide expert testimony if needed. I compiled every piece of financial documentation going back 2 years, bank statements, credit card records, gas receipts, phone records, everything. And I started keeping a detailed written log of my wife's movements and stated whereabouts, cross-referencing her explanations with the PI surveillance data to document every single time her story didn't match where she actually was. I filed for divorce on fault-based grounds of adultery under RSA 458.7 in the Hillsborough County Circuit Court, Family Division. The petition named the co-respondent by his full legal name, included his home address in Dover, and formally alleged that he had engaged in a sexual relationship with my wife that caused the breakdown of our 18-year marriage. A process server delivered the papers to my wife at our home on a morning when I'd made sure our daughter was already at school. She called me within 20 minutes, sobbing, asking me what was happening and why I was doing this. I told her that I knew about the man in Portsmouth, that I knew about the visits to his townhouse in Dover, that I had photographs, PI surveillance logs, GPS data, and time-stamped evidence covering a period of months. She went silent for close to 15 seconds, which is an eternity when you're standing on the other end of a phone call that's ending your marriage. Then she started with the script that I think most people in her position default to when they've run out of room to deny what's been proven. She said it was a mistake, that it didn't mean anything, that she still loved me, and that she was willing to work on things if I'd give her the chance. I told her that the petition had already been filed and that the co-respondent would be served within the next 48 hours at his place of employment. That's when the sobbing turned into panic, because she realized this wasn't just about our marriage anymore. The man she'd been seeing was about to get legal papers delivered to his job, identifying him by name as the co-respondent in a fault-based adultery divorce, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. The co-respondent was served at his office 3 days later. According to what my attorney learned through the discovery process, his wife found out that same evening because he came home and told her before she could hear it from someone else. Their marriage didn't survive the month. She filed for divorce within 3 weeks of finding out, and from what the PI gathered through public records, she cited irreconcilable differences rather than adultery, probably because she wanted it over as quickly and quietly as possible with 2 young kids involved. But the damage was already done. His name was on a court document in Hillsborough County, identifying him as the co-respondent in an adultery case, and that document was part of the public record that anyone with a computer could access. Meanwhile, my wife hired an attorney and came out swinging with a counter petition requesting no-fault grounds of irreconcilable differences, primary physical custody of our daughter, exclusive use of the marital home, and spousal support consistent with our income disparity. She wanted the fault allegations dropped because she knew exactly what those findings would do to her position on property, alimony, and custody. My attorney said absolutely not, and then my wife did something that I genuinely didn't think she was capable of, and it was the single worst strategic decision she made throughout the entire proceedings. She tried to turn our daughter against me, It started with comments that seemed small at first. Things like, "Your father is trying to destroy this family, and he's doing this to punish me, not to protect you." Then it escalated to direct attempts to undermine my relationship with our daughter, telling her that I was being vindictive, that the divorce was unnecessary, that I was choosing to humiliate her mother in public when we could have handled things privately. She told our daughter that filing a fault-based divorce was cruel and that a real man would have tried to work things out instead of dragging lawyers and investigators into it. What she didn't realize was that our daughter had been the one who brought the evidence to me in the first place. Our daughter had watched her mother kiss another man through a restaurant window. Our daughter could not drive home because her hands were shaking so bad she couldn't hold the steering wheel. Our daughter had handed me that phone and made the conscious choice to tell the truth instead of protecting a lie. And now her mother was standing in the kitchen trying to convince her that I was the villain in this story. My daughter didn't buy a single word of it. She told her therapist everything her mother was saying to her, and the therapist documented each instance in the clinical record. Under New Hampshire custody law, RSA 461-A.6 lists specific factors the court must consider when determining the best interests of the child, and one of those factors is whether either parent has engaged in a pattern of conduct designed to alienate the child from the other parent. My wife's attorney either didn't advise her to stop or couldn't control her because the behavior continued for weeks, and every single instance went straight into the therapist's notes and into our filing. When my attorney presented that documentation to the court alongside the original evidence of the affair and its impact on our daughter, the picture it painted was devastating for my wife's custody position. She wasn't just a spouse who'd committed adultery. She was a parent who, after being caught, actively attempted to manipulate her own child's perception of the situation rather than shielding her from the conflict. The judge took that very seriously. The final orders came down after months of proceedings that cost both sides more than anyone wanted to spend. On property, the court applied an unequal division of the marital estate under RSA 458.16a, awarding me 58% of the total assets and my wife 42%. The judge cited the proven adultery as a contributing factor to the breakdown of the marriage and noted that the emotional distress caused to both me and our daughter met the threshold for a fault-based adjustment. I retained the house with its accumulated equity, my full retirement account, and my consulting business assets, which were classified as separate property since I'd established the business before the marriage. She received her share of the remaining community assets, her own retirement contributions, and the car that had been titled in her name. On alimony, my wife's attorney had initially requested term alimony of $2,800 per month for 9 years, which was the maximum duration under RSA 458.19-A, based on our 18-year marriage. The court denied that request, given the fault finding, the documented pattern of deception, and the dissipation of marital time and resources toward the extramarital relationship. The judge awarded rehabilitative alimony of $1,400 per month for 3 years, less than half of what she'd asked for in both amount and duration. The ruling specifically noted that fault was a statutory factor under RSA 458.19 and that the petitioning spouse had met the evidentiary burden to justify a downward departure from what would have otherwise been a standard calculation. On custody, this is where it stopped being about money and started being about the most important person in both of our lives. The court awarded me primary physical custody of our daughter under RSA 461-A.6. My wife received standard visitation, but the judge's order included specific language addressing the documented pattern of parental alienation attempts and directed that both parents refrain from making disparaging remarks about the other in the child's presence. The therapist's testimony was referenced directly in the custody order, and the judge noted that the child had expressed a clear and consistent preference to reside primarily with her father, which carried significant weight, given that she was 17 and less than a year from legal adulthood. My daughter sat in the hallway outside the courtroom during most of the proceedings because neither of us wanted her inside that room listening to the details. But when I walked out and told her the outcome, she hugged me in a way that she hadn't hugged me since she was a little girl. And that moment alone made every dollar I'd spent on attorneys and investigators and therapists worth it 10 times over. The co-respondent's marriage was over within 6 weeks of him being served. His wife took both kids, filed in Stratford County, and from what I gathered through the public record, the settlement was swift and not favorable to him. I don't know, and I don't care whether he and my ex-wife continued seeing each other after everything came out. That part of the story stopped being my problem the moment the judge signed the final decree. My wife moved into a 2-bedroom apartment closer to Manchester and went back to working full-time to cover her expenses on a $42,000 salary with reduced alimony that would expire in 3 years. Meanwhile, I stayed in the house where my daughter could finish her senior year without having to switch schools or uproot her life during the most important academic stretch she'd ever face. She got into her first choice college, and when I drove her to campus that fall with the back of my truck packed with everything she owned, I realized that the entire previous year, as brutal as it had been, had ultimately led to this moment where she was standing on her own 2 feet with a clear head and a future she'd earned. The hardest part of this entire experience wasn't the betrayal itself, even though that cut deeper than I ever thought something could cut. The hardest part was watching my daughter carry the weight of what she'd seen through that restaurant window and knowing that her mother had put her in a position no child should ever have to be in. She didn't ask to see what she saw that morning in Portsmouth. She was just a senior in high school doing something dumb with her best friend, and the universe dropped a grenade in her lap that detonated her entire understanding of what her family actually was. And then, instead of her mother stepping up and being honest and shielding her from the fallout, her mother tried to weaponize her against the one parent who was trying to protect her. That's the part I'll never fully get past. I tell this story because I know there are people out there right now sitting with the kind of evidence that could change the trajectory of their divorce, and they're hesitating because they don't know what to do with it, or they're afraid of what happens next. If your child comes to you with something like this, listen to them, believe them, and protect them by doing this the right way through an attorney who understands your state's specific laws. Don't confront without a strategy. Don't destroy evidence in a fit of emotion, and don't underestimate how much your state's fault-based provisions can change the outcome of your property division, your alimony exposure, and your custody arrangement. In New Hampshire, the co-respondent requirement alone is a tool that most people have never even heard of, and it shifts the entire power dynamic of the proceedings because suddenly the affair isn't just your problem anymore. It's a legal reality that everyone involved has to answer for. I didn't come out of this without damage. Nobody does. But I came out of it with my daughter safe, my finances intact, and my self-respect still in the same place I left it. And that outcome didn't happen by accident. It happened because a 17-year-old girl had the courage to tell the truth, and her father had the discipline to build a case before he said a single word out of anger. Tony once said in one of his videos, "Women can sometimes make great teachers. They can teach you what kind of woman you don't want. Stay strong out there, and remember, don't let your emotions drive your decisions."